Facebook is getting us there. If you can see us, we will be with you as soon as it finishes processing. Okay, we should be live. Yes. All right, we are live and we'll start in a moment. I'm working multiple computers. There we go. Welcome everyone. We will get started in one moment. Just letting some people log on. Thank you for coming. Feel free to put anything in the chat if you like. I'm looking away to see you there and to see my lovely guests here. Welcome, welcome. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and get started because I like to be timely. So welcome everybody and welcome to my two speakers. I just briefly wanted to say why I wanted to do this session. It's been concerning me for a number of years. It seems like children are under a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety for a variety of reasons, not necessarily related to COVID, although I think that has added another layer. But between the fear of gun violence and shootings in schools, I know a lot of young people that I speak with are so concerned about the climate crisis and feeling like we're on a collision course there. Then you hear about social media and pressures and, you know, all the normal things we experienced growing up. And I don't hear a lot of people outside of a few families talking about it. We hear a lot about adult mental health. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about it, see what the issues are, and hopefully walk away with something that we can do to make the situation better. So I have two wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people here. I have Mary Peniston, who has, and I'm going to read from this, over 30 years of experience in education, early childhood, economic development, and philanthropy. Among her many past roles, she has served as a special assistant to the superintendent of schools in Norwalk. She's worked in the private and public banking sectors. She is my go-to for public policy, and she is currently Chief Program Officer of Child First, which is described, and Mary, feel free to chime in later, it's described as a cost-effective, home-based intervention program for young, vulnerable children and their families. And Michaela Fissel is the Executive Director of Advocacy Unlimited, a nonprofit organization that provides education, advocacy, and support to promote individual growth, human rights, and systems transformation in the areas of mental health and addiction. And Michaela also brings the perspective of serving on her local school board. And I'm proud to say tonight that mental health is not a partisan issue, because here we have me, a Democratic town committee member, and Michaela, a Republican town committee member. But I think if there's nothing else I like to promote, a lot of these issues are not partisan, but somehow they become made that way. Mental health is definitely not a partisan issue, and we can all play a part in the solution. So thank you both for being here and taking time out of your very busy schedules. Before we jump in with questions, I just want to ground the audience. I see some more people have joined us. Welcome. I want to ground the audience and maybe us in some common language, and please refute this. I was thinking about the difference between mental health and mental illness, and I think people use them interchangeably, and sometimes for the good, sometimes not for the good. So I'm defining mental health, according to some experts, as emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act, and helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. So basically, your mental well-being. And just like physical health, you could be anywhere on the continuum and it can change. I could be a marathoner in my 20s and be in peak physical health, but maybe by the time I'm 50 something, my health is a little different. And then mental illness is often used to refer to someone with, I'll say, so-called disorders such as schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, ADHD, etc. And a mental health, and so a concern around mental health tends to be labeled an illness when it affects someone's ability to function. So I just wanted to throw that out. So as we're all talking, we know what we're talking about. And then regardless of the nomenclature that we use, a few quick stats that have caught my attention. In any given year in the US, nearly 1 in 5 adults experience some form of mental illness. 1 in 25 adults experience a serious mental illness. 1 in 6 youth aged 6 to 17 experience a mental health disorder. I just think these are so powerful. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the US. This shocked me. It accounts for twice the number of lives lost due to homicide, about 41,000 people a year. 1 in 10 young people experience a period of major depression. And half of mental health disorders show first signs before a person turns 14, and 3/4 of the disorders before someone turns 24. And lastly, less than 20% of children and adolescents with diagnosable mental health problems receive the treatment they need. So when I came across all these stats, it's very sobering, but I'm hoping today is also about what we can do as citizens, what some of the loopholes are, and what's working. So I'm gonna jump in. So thank you again for being here. I will not talk as much from now on. So I'm gonna start with you, Mary. One thing that I hadn't given a lot of thought to previously is this idea about how children react to trauma and how that interferes with their brain development. So all of that, of course, will have an impact on how they do in school, but also how the system intervenes in their life at some point along the spectrum. So can you talk a little bit about what I'll call the science of how trauma affects young brains, and what types of things would you categorize as trauma? Because I think people imagine huge events, but I'd like you to touch upon that if you could.
Sure. So I think the first thing I want to say is there are lots of things that I think are leading us to healthy discussions about thinking about mental health. And so particularly since I'm in the early childhood field, I can't go without talking about it without mentioning a very important study, which is called the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And I'm sure Michaela can speak to it also. But the reason it's so important is for 2 reasons. Number one is it was a study that really started off looking at problems of obesity. And the 2 shocking things they discovered in doing a study of 17,000 adults that were enrolled in Kaiser Permanente in California were, one, that people that were suffering from obesity had a series of what were called adverse childhood experiences, which at that time they were just measuring for things like Had they suffered from physical or verbal abuse, or had there been physical neglect? Or did they have a parent who was an alcoholic, or a mother who was a victim of domestic violence, or they lost a parent because of divorce, or they went to prison? And it's actually quite surprising how many families experience these kinds of things. And what we don't realize is they happen at a very young age, and they impact people long-term in their adult life, both physically and mentally. So the two things are, one is the roots of mental health are really rooted in childhood, and B, that mental health and physical health are inextricably linked. And those are two very important things for us to know about. So,
And what period, I'm sorry to interrupt, what period, what years do they consider childhood?
they looked at children up to the age of 18.
Okay.
And certainly the statistics that you were citing, that a lot of mental health problems get identified by the time they're 14.
Mm-hmm.
But as we're learning more and more about early childhood brain development, what we're finding out that actually many of these problems have roots in the very early years of a child's life, and what kind of environments they're growing up in terms of what kind of stressors are they being exposed to, and if they're in if they have what are called protective factors, so that they might have some adult in their life that makes them feel safe. Because even though you might feel threatened by a traumatic or a scary event, if you have an adult that you feel protected by, your brain doesn't react in the same way. So I won't go through all of the science except to say that there are actually chemical things that go on in the development of the brain, such that when a child is consistently exposed to stressors, and there's no one that they feel protected by for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
that in fact the child brain develop in a different way, and it really begins to be the root of what can become much more serious issues. And this isn't to make people feel bad or say there's certain groups, but to recognize just how important it is for us to support families with young children and to help really create secure environments, because if we don't do that, you end up with both physical and mental problems, and the mental health problems are the ones that are hidden and so inextricably linked with physical problems. So the largest physical health diseases we have are highly correlated with children that have been through traumatic experiences in their childhood.
And just one more follow-up question. Is there any data about what's considered traumatic? I mean, is it, things we might think about, obviously some sort of domestic violence in the home, or, the loss of a parent, something like that? Or is it a wider?
It can be wider. So it could be things, a serious car accident, a serious disease. And in fact, people are also talking about racism. It can be also a systemic kind of trauma that people have to live with. So I'll have to look up a more precise definition of trauma, but it is something that is puts stress on you that totally upends your life, either momentarily or for an extended period of time. And so there are many events, and when we have short periods of trauma, we can often be resilient. It's more when we're in the face of constant traumas that I think it's very hard for young children to be able to adapt, and it's so important for them to have adults around them that can make them feel protected.
And I would imagine young children don't have that same perception of time. So a short time could seem like a long time. And I like what you said. And again, it's not an approach you hear a lot about, the link between mental and physical. Like, we tend to silo everything, when a more holistic approach, I think, is usually helpful in most fields. And Michaela, I know I've seen you write about and talk about this holistic approach. Would you like to add anything about why you think that's important?
Sure, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. As a person who's in long-term recovery from mental health and addiction challenges, and as a survivor of childhood trauma, I know it's possible when we focus on resilience and we create secure environments for people to make sense of what's happened to them, orient themselves in life, and identify what are the next steps, right, for taking control of the outcomes of our life, right? Because so often with trauma, it feels like there's a loss of control, like everything's happening to us or being done to me, and I can lose my sense of personal agency. And I really appreciate, Mary, your reference to how trauma is so, it affects both mental health and physical health, right? There's this link. And I'd like to reference a researcher and a practitioner named Vanderkolk, who wrote an amazing book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
Super accessible information for anyone who'd like to learn more how trauma can live in the body. It leaves a physical impression on our nervous system. And what you were speaking about, Mary, right, the chemical kind of our neurotransmitters and how we adapt to our environments. And he has this really beautiful quote: "The issues are in our tissues."
Yeah.
I love that.
Isn't it so easy? And yet it feels so big and complicated. And so one thing that I believe very much in is holistic practices, right? So if we know that the issues are in our tissues and we can feel trauma in the body through the fight, flight, or freeze response that is just natural and innate to being human, then we know that using practices that allow us to feel safe in our bodies will help to alleviate some of the stress and be able to work through whatever it is that we may be carrying with us. And so at Advocacy Unlimited, we offer a stress management and holistic wellness center called Toivo, which is located in Hartford on Park Street. We'll be opening again soon. However, what we also know is that yoga, meditation, any sort of mindfulness-based practice, qigong, that these practices can allow a person to begin to feel once again safe in their bodies. And the research shows that if you can alleviate that feeling of stress within the body and bring calm to the nervous system, it can allow the body to repair. Yeah. And what's so beautiful about the holistic practices, it also, just as it affects or can have a positive impact on the body, it can also alleviate the stress that the mind can carry. Yeah. And so what I've found through my experience I've been practicing yoga for about 6 years now. I'm actually should be done soon with my 200-hour yoga teacher training.
Oh, great. Maybe I'll take a class. I've been putting it off for way too long.
Please, I would love that. All are welcome, especially at Toivo, all are welcome through Toivo's doors. And so what I found is that the mind can attach to these stories, right? And so that's what we often will describe as flashbacks. It's hard to let go of what's happened to us. The mind loves to regret the past and linger there, or jump to the future and worry about all the to-dos that we have left undone.
Yeah. Yes.
And these mindfulness practices allow us to regain stability in the present moment and to be here now. And so really, truly holistic practices allow people to regain a sense of personal agency, to know that they are safe in their own bodies, and allow their mind to be in the present moment so they can truly make the next right decision for themselves.
That's amazing. A quick aside, I went to a meditation retreat, and the most transformative thing they told me was, now is perfect. When it's not, you're either borrowing something from the past or projecting something that's about to happen. And that one sentence has really allowed me to try to live in the present in a way that was not true prior. But I'm sorry, Mary, you were going to say something?
No, I was just glad. I wanted to pick up on a theme that Michaela was doing, which is the issue that people are often dealing with very difficult issues. And so what's so comforting is there are so many points at which there can be healing.
Mm.
And I think that Michaela would agree that we want to address these issues as early as possible. And we know about all kinds of stressors that we might not be able to change in the environment. So the good news is, even when people have gone through very traumatic events, and our bodies do remember, and there's even lots of research that's coming up that trauma is even passed on intergenerationally. So if there have been difficult situations, yes, because actually part of this they're discovering is there's epigenetics involved, which is both that some of the things can be passed through genes, but also the traumatic events can turn on and off certain characteristics in our genes. But I think we have to weigh with that there are lots of challenges we have, but I was happy to hear that I think we both agree there are lots of ways that we can work with children and families and adults in ways that they can be healed.
Well, I have to say a lot of what you both said touches upon what I want to talk about next, because after the murder of George Floyd, a lot has happened in our society, but I found myself unpacking a lot of old memories that I had forgotten about, try to suppress, etc. And I'm like, a lot of things that have been traumatic have happened, but I just keep going. So this idea you mentioned, resilience, Michaela. So just for a moment, bringing a racial justice lens to this conversation, how is all of this impacting communities of color, either here in Connecticut or in general? Any thoughts?
I mean, well, there's a measurable disparity, and it spans across the lifespan, and it can be seen across all systems. So if you're a person of color, the access to mental health treatment, there's barriers to that. There's higher rates of incarceration. Even our children are diagnosed at a higher rate with antipsychotic medication if you're a Black boy in comparison to a white boy for the same observable behaviors. So these are real measurable disparities, and we're just starting to scratch the surface and unpack the systemic racism.
Anything to add, Mary?
Yeah, I agree. It's not a new issue, and it's across all kinds of institutions. So imagine what it's like for someone growing up where you are facing all the time being told you are less than and treated differently in society. And there is the classic case of, Black boys are over-identified for special ed services in schools, and there is an uncomfortable dynamic we don't always like to talk about, which is most teachers are white women. And oftentimes when children have been through traumatic events, they express their feelings through their behaviors. And those behaviors are sometimes, we don't understand that behaviors are sometimes ways for young children to communicate. So instead of trying to get at the root of what's going on, we simply want to push the problem away. We make assumptions, and we start a whole change of events that gets worse and worse. So I think understanding the trauma of racism and how ingrained it is in so many of our practices, that we have to understand how it plays into mental health issues too.
Yeah, another interesting side note, I was right before I went into kindergarten, I think it was my Head Start program, wanted to put me on the special education track because they said I had deficits and all of these things. It just turned out I was shy. And luckily my mother could advocate for me, and I have a twin, and we were separated for the first time. And, nothing like that was taken into account, but luckily my mother convinced them otherwise. Um,
Can I?
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, there is an amazing group of Black leaders in Connecticut who are tackling systemic racism within our educational institutions. So it's the Black Leaders and Administrators Consortium. And I would strongly encourage anyone who is listening right now or who connects to check out their work. They are tackling equity and excellence. And if you'd like to see a model district, I'm very proud of the fact that I come from Windsor. That's where I was raised and I continue to live. The Windsor Public Schools is doing an amazing job raising this topic for discussion through the leadership of the superintendent and then through the leadership of Dr. Terrell Hill and Dr. Santasha Oliver, who are both part of Black. Yep.
No, that's perfect. So it sounds to me like we've talked a lot about prevention, but I think we all share the same view that most of mental health services are geared around intervention. And I would love if you just address, one, do you think that's true? Is it equal parts prevention, intervention? Are we too heavily weighted one way or another? I'll say Mary.
Clearly, there are issues that arise that require intervention. So we would be naive to think that intervention isn't necessary. But I believe that in general, we prefer putting off dealing with a problem until it gets so grave that you have to then deal with it as an intervention.
Mhm.
When you could be much more effective if we would invest more on the front end and really prevent problems getting that serious. We already know what leads to so many causes of mental health and so many disparities. And yet, because they don't seem like such big problems, we put off dealing with them. So,
can you give an example? Just, I don't want to put you on the spot, but.
This may be a strange example, but for instance, if you want to have services, particularly for mental health services, maybe with and have it paid through Medicaid or an insurance company, you have to have a diagnosis. If you're talking about young children may already be exhibiting behaviors that you can kind of see where it's going, or you already see the risk in the family. They don't have a diagnosis yet. And yet we know children 3 to 5 who are already starting to show evidence of behavioral problems, et cetera, are likely to develop more serious mental health issues later on. And so what is our response? Our response is, for instance, then, oh, well, it's a problem child. We just expel them from the preschool because it's too problematic. So rather than really looking deeper about what's going on, trying to get at the root of the problem and making the investment that's necessary to try to repair what's gone on at a time when it's much cheaper to make that investment than to wait where a child then goes through, they lose time in school, that they develop more serious problems, and it becomes more and more difficult to help that child heal.
Yeah, absolutely. And Michaela, intervention, prevention, do we have it right?
Yeah, so I have this desire to throw it all out and restart because I become concerned when, as Mary, you were saying, we have a model that requires that we pathologize. And by doing that, we automatically put a label on a child who is having a normal reaction to unreasonable circumstances. And so when we say prevention, of course, We'd want to create space for that little one to feel safe, to really feel seen, heard, and valued. So they don't continue along a trajectory that would require an intervention and involvement in a mental health system of care. So I believe we can do better in that earlier stages of life to support families and to create safe and secure spaces for our children to have access to trusted adults who can create that container for them to feel seen, heard, and valued. And I would like to reference social emotional learning. SEL curriculum is critically important, not just within the schools, but also offering in-home support so our families can also have language and tools for supporting their little ones to be able to manage everyday stressors and also traumas that do occur in a young person's life. As Mary, you referenced the ACEs study, it could even be something that must happen because it's adult stuff, like a divorce. That is a trauma in a child's life. And are we equipping our little ones with the tools to be able to navigate that emotional experience? I would say that we aren't as a society. We're actually, I would say, doing the opposite.
I think
Yes.
you're right. Mary, you just touched upon something about sort of this system of you need a diagnosis to seek care. And I know sort of the way the insurance companies work around this has created some difficulties, although there have been some legislation at the national level aimed at fixing this. Like I remember way back when I was young, one of my first jobs, reading over the healthcare plan, there was definitely a difference between physical, like what they would reimburse, or mental health. And a lot of, one of the things that sparked this topic, I was talking to a young person who mentioned how they had a friend who had been under care, but then aged out of their parents' insurance, and their new job didn't offer the same kind of package. So they were just going without care because, you know, it just wouldn't be reimbursed. So I know there are some legal safeguards, but do you think we've gone far enough? Is there a need, or I guess let me rephrase that. Is there something in the insurance reimbursement area that you think could be tweaked or fixed to make sure that anyone who needs care is getting it without sort of this hurdle?
I mean, I certainly know, since in the experience I've had in some states working with Medicaid, is that, and also with other insurance companies, that while at least on the books there are ways to pay for these services, they are paid at such a low rate that it doesn't cover the cost of the services, and that there are also often rules about maximum amounts that can be paid out. And I think if we're going to talk about within a business context, I have to go back to the issue of you don't wait until it's a highly medicalized issue, and you have to deal with it earlier, and better to take care of it right in the beginning. And also, some of these investments we have to make are not necessarily within the healthcare system. Because I think the other really interesting discussion that's going on nowadays, that was a discussion really started by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, was really about how many things really affect our health. And it's not just about going and getting formal health care, but the environments in which we live and et cetera are super influence our health, as we discussed earlier. And they're called the social determinants of health. And even now, some states are looking at in order to actually have long-term savings in Medicaid, et cetera, they're beginning to do experiments about maybe they should be investing in some of them. So for instance, in North Carolina, they're going to do some test investments in food security, housing security, and transportation security, because they feel these are highly correlated with health. And if these issues were addressed, they actually think they would see savings in the health system. So I think it opens up a discussion about, I think we've looked at healthcare too much as dealing with the issue when it is something that is diagnosable and medicalized. Mm-hmm. And it's the whole thing about the mind body. It all goes together, and the environments in which we live in a context. We are extremely social beings, and we should not minimize the environments that we live in, how much it affects our health. So if you live in a dangerous neighborhood, if you don't have access to good water, if you have to worry about having food, you don't get enough food, all these things affect our physical and mental health.
I think more people now with the pandemic are realizing this. And Michaela, anything to add about the insurance system? And
well, I would really like to see peer-delivered services reimbursed. Yeah, that's something that I continue to seek as a mental health advocate. Yeah, I don't have very much to add to that, Mary. I think you did a great job summarizing
you wanted to talk
that
a little bit more in case someone doesn't know what you mean by peer services?
Oh, sure. So, yeah, so peer services. So peer services are offered by people who have experienced mental health and addiction challenges. Here in Connecticut, we have Advocacy Unlimited, and we have CCAR, which is the Connecticut Community on Addiction Recovery. These are the two leading peer-run organizations in the state of Connecticut. So we all identify as people who have navigated mental health and or addiction challenges to some varying degree. All of us often will describe what we're talking here today about having navigated circumstances beyond our control during childhood. And so peer support services are delivered by a peer support specialist, which is a whole training and education program. And peer specialists are often employed on a team. And so they'll work with a social worker or other professionals within a mental health service organization to enhance the quality of care, really. And what we're finding in the research nationally is that you can offer peer-delivered services and it leads to longer and more sustainable recovery. And when I say the word recovery, this is an exit out of higher treatment levels. Mm-hmm. Essentially, it's about bringing somebody into a supportive environment, them getting what they need, and then them moving on with their life. And so one of the limitations within our current model is that, right, you want to keep someone engaged in treatment because that allows the service provider to continue to be reimbursed for those services, which is a sustainable model for the business. However, what's that continuing to perpetuate? Well, a cycle of dependency and learned helplessness over time, especially when you have a vulnerable person who doesn't have those social determinants in place and have been maybe told their whole life that they are broken or bad or wrong for a number of reasons, one of them being a diagnosis. So I've got some concerns about our current insurance medical model that I won't get too much more into here today, but I would love to see peer-delivered services reimbursed here in Connecticut, and so we can have access to peer support across both commercial insurance, public insurance, and within every setting where people may be seeking some sort of support for their emotional wellness.
Well, I know I remember seeing a bill introduced about that, or planning to be introduced. It was in committee before the legislature had to shut down for COVID, but maybe in 2021. Sorry, Mary, it looked like you were about to.
Oh, I was just going to say, I appreciate what you're saying, because I do think having peers can be very important, very healing, and very supportive. And the only difference of opinion I would have is when it is within a medical context, I do think we should honor that those can be parts of treatment. But I would also like for us to think that not everything has to be paid for through medical systems, and can impact both mental health and physical health. So I was just thinking about, I think we need to think about mental health and physical health in a broader sense, and that this isn't just about having the healthcare sector pay for it. It's
OMG, Mary, I would be open to receiving any calls from anyone on this Zoom live, Facebook Live, who's interested in finding alternative funding for peer support services in the state of Connecticut. 100% agree. Let's not join the model.
Yeah, there's not enough money spent on most social services, and this is no different. I have a few more questions, but I'm going to call Katya in. I think there might be a question or two in the audience.
Yes, hi.
Everyone meet Katya, my wonderful intern.
Hello. Firstly, I just wanted to say, like, from someone just watching you guys talk about this is so interesting and so like enlightening. So many of these things that you guys are talking about, I've never thought of the way that you guys obviously have. We have a comment in the comments from Kay, and I know you guys already touched on this a little bit, but I didn't know if someone wanted to add something. She's asking, what preventative action can short circuit ongoing trauma children are enduring, especially when they don't have an adult at home to turn to?
So for young children, you have to remember that oftentimes the parents themselves have been traumatized. And so part of the work that I help support, even though I'm not representing the organization I work with, is really about when you're working with children, they live within a context of a family and you have to deal with the whole family environment. So we do treatment also about addressing the trauma of the parents and how that affects their relationship with the child. So that would be number one, that first, you always want to believe in the capacity of a family to be healthy and to be able to heal. And so human beings, when they have the right kind of supports, I think have great capacity to heal. But unfortunately, there will be times when it's been too severe or it can't be healed. And in that case, a safety of a child has to come first. And there may be other relatives who can take on that role. And then in the worst of cases, they may have to be with a different family, but we try always to keep a child with their family. But if a family's not getting that support, I think often then families get caught up in a vortex of a system that doesn't always respect a family. And so my thing, this is another reason why I think about parents are not inherently bad. Oftentimes their behaviors are because they themselves suffered very much and they have not been able to work through their own trauma. And this is how it gets to be intergenerational in one way. And so I think that if we want healthy families, rather than blaming, oh, they're a bad mother or a bad father or whatever, there's also meaning behind what they do. We have to get to the bottom of what happened to them. So often parents want the best for their children. So you want to heal both the parent and the child, and to do it early on when it doesn't get so severe. So, but unfortunately, there will be some times where you have to think of the safety of the child. And for one reason or another, it can't be done. But there's a big movement nationally not to take those recourses. At the federal level, they are rethinking around child welfare about they want to stop having children going into foster care, and they want to invest more in prevention services. So there's a very exciting movement that's been going on in the past 2 years, and there's been new legislation at the federal level that all states are going to be able to use federal monies more from preventing children going into foster care and helping healing and supporting the families so children can stay with their families, which I think is absolutely the right way to go.
2 follow-up questions. I have 3 really, but and Katya, interrupt me if there are more questions. Since you're talking about supports, and Kay's question reminds me, are there, if anyone's listening or watching this later and they don't know where to go, what would you recommend? I know I was helping a constituent, or hopefully a would-be constituent, with a problem a few weeks ago, and I had to call 211, which is a hotline run by United Way. And I thought it was very helpful. Are there other resources out there that you would mention on today's call if anyone wants more information or needs somewhere to turn?
I would recommend family resource centers. Many districts now have family resource centers, and they meet the families where they're at, and they're a hub for community resources that are local.
Thank you. Wait, Mary, you're muted.
And if families are in crisis, we also have a network of child guidance centers, which can provide services for if things are difficult. And then I also know that given with the isolation that so many families are in and the pressures and stresses that families feel under, I don't know a lot about it, but there was a hotline that's been created at the state level called Talk It Out CT, talkitoutct.com, that is trying to be a hotline if things are getting elevated, that parents have a place to talk about what's going on to see if you can lower it from getting elevated. So, and I'm sure that there are also longer strategies of trying to create peer groups. There's some good work being done around what's called circle of security, so that there are parent groups, so parents can support parents, which is why I love Michaela's idea of the peer supports can be just so important. So there are lots of resources, and you're right, family resource centers are in the business of knowing about how to connect families with services. We're really lucky to have that network in Connecticut.
And my second follow-up, you mentioned federal money, and I know Child First just received that, I think it was $3 million grant from the federal government. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that is for?
So there's a recognition at the federal level in multiple departments. So SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Agency that's part of HHS, does lots of work to try to promote training and services that will support families to prevent substance abuse and mental health. And they've been doing a lot of work in early childhood. So they have a network that's the National Child Traumatic Stress Initiative, and Child First was fortunate enough to be awarded this grant to do training in communities for people that work with, that do home visiting or work with families with young children, to train them on understanding trauma better, understanding about what are appropriate steps to take in these cases, as well as also creating a larger, very well-trained workforce that can deal with families that are facing more challenges. So it's very exciting because it's part of a larger network that's working on this. So
That's great.
yes.
I just remembered another resource. So they're the Behavioral Health Action Council. So if you're in the Fairfield County area, it would be the hub. And if you're in the Hartford area, it is Amplify CT. But if you go online, you can check out the regional behavioral health action organizations. And they also offer a number of resources in the area of mental health and addiction, and they cross the lifespan now.
Perfect. Any other questions out there?
We have no more questions, but I wanted to highlight a comment that Emily left. If anyone is interested in learning more about the ACEs study that I know Mary mentioned earlier, she recommends a documentary that is called Resilience, and she says it's a great way to learn more about that.
Thank you, Emily. I just have a couple of other questions. I know there are currently some school-based programs. It doesn't seem on a wide scale, but spot programs here and there. Is there anything that you've seen that you would recommend, or that school systems should be looking into adopting to help with everything we've talked about, to both, I've seen samples of, I guess they're called tiered programs, where there's sort of like one level of in-school support for all kids, like just to be able to talk about issues, even through curriculum, but then increased level of interaction if the kids have greater needs. I've also read about like some trauma programs in schools. Is there anything that you've seen that's working great, that parents should think about looking for in the schools that they're involved with? Michaela, I went to Mary first last time.
So what you were mentioning about the tiered approach, that the multi-tiered systems of support, and it is similar to a wraparound model. So it looks at behavioral, social, emotional, and academics. And I believe most districts in Connecticut are using an MTSS system, and it's really guided by the data, right? So it allows there to be an individualized approach to meeting a child where they're at within the classroom, across all of those dimensions. And so just taking that idea of a tiered approach and, a gradual, right, approach to working with a child, I would really strongly encourage parents to sit down with their kiddos and create that safe, secure space where their child can be seen, heard, and valued, and not push assumptions on what that child might be experiencing. And that's really just what I wanted to share. And if you'd like to learn more about what your district is offering, I would strongly encourage you to also develop a relationship with your child's school and ask questions. Oftentimes as parents, maybe we haven't had the best experience ourselves going through an education system. And so we can feel a bit guarded, like, oh, they're the professionals, they're the educators, they're the ones with like the degrees, right? And so they have more knowledge than I would have as a parent. However, I've been witnessing, thankfully, more and more of an open door policy where families are invited into the schools to be able to inform the educators, inform the administrators and all the staff about what that individual child's experience is. And so there is more of a willingness in everybody's lives to be able to lean in and really support that child across all contexts, which is so critically important.
That's great. And Mary, you were going to
I was going to say that I agree, because for so long education was structured in such a way that I think social emotional development was really underplayed. I think it was done well, like say in kindergarten, but then it was very much about being performance oriented. And so I do agree that there's more awareness. Also, giving tools to teachers to understand about behaviors of children and helping children to be able to express how they feel and that that's okay is important. But I also think we have work to do, that we need to have adequately supportive systems that when children behave in a way that might be difficult in a classroom, we have to reduce our instinct of expelling children from school, because it just aggravates it. And if a child is behaving in a way that's difficult for a school to deal with, then they either need community supports, but you don't take it out on the child, because that has big consequences. And also because expulsion systems, we expel much more Black and brown children and much more boys. And it is the famous school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share like one quick story, which I shared with you, Stephanie, which was, I was sort of shocked early on when I got into the early childhood field to discover that two people that I admired a great deal that were in the early childhood field had both been at the state level running prison systems, one in Massachusetts and one in Pennsylvania. And both of them said, I heard too many stories of prisoners, of the trauma they went through when they were young children and how it led them down a path. And so that the school to prison pipeline doesn't start in school, it starts much earlier. And both of them ended up changing their career paths and went into supporting early childhood systems.
That's amazing. And I'm glad you mentioned this thing about suspension and expulsion, because I did see there are some programs that are moving away from that and having a school community approach. And that seems like another good preventative action. What time is it? We have just a couple more minutes. I had 2 more questions, but instead what I'll do is say, anything else we did not cover that you would love to be known to this audience, or any final words?
Thank you so much for having me, Stephanie. It's been wonderful dialoguing with both you and Mary. I am here just as Michaela, although I did mention my organization a couple times. So I really appreciate you creating this space, Stephanie, and best of luck with your campaign.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to mention this wonderful new discovery, more recent discovery called neuroplasticity. So we do actually have the ability to change our brains. So neuro meaning brain, plasticity meaning changeable or malleable. And there's this really great saying, I believe very much in mantras, and affirmations. So change your mind, change your brain. What you focus on grows. So if we continue as systems, as people, to focus on the pathology of a child's behavior, as we describe it as a pathology, right, through the DSM, then in essence, we're reinforcing that belief that that child is broken. And whether or not we hold a different belief within ourselves, if we're continuing to focus on that disorder or even defining it as a mental illness, then we are in some way going to continue to perpetuate this belief that some people, there's this class of people who are less than. And so I would just ask that as a society, as people, we really lean in and unpack how we're showing up in relation to other people, and that we focus on what we want to grow. So if we have a child who may be struggling, how do we redirect that child to focusing on their strengths and maybe directing them towards supports that are going to foster a sense of resilience and knowing that they are already whole. So that is what I had to share. So thank you.
That's amazing. Mary, final words?
Thank you, Michaela, for saying that. And I also mentioned where I work, but I'm not representing them in this talk. And so glad to have this opportunity to have this discussion. And I hope that my parting words would be, I guess, that that when we think about mental health or mental illness, that we remember that it's really part of a larger whole. And one of the wonderful things about being able to be in the public sector and to be able to think about how we have a stronger society is that we need to support families and children. And that's the best way to have a healthy society and good health for families, both physical and mental health.
I agree with both of those statements, and I cannot say them better. And hopefully, if there is legislation that can get us there, I know there were, I think this year, there were about 5 different bills that would have address different sides of this issue. So hopefully we'll see them again in 2021, and hopefully we'll all be a little kinder to ourselves and anyone we come into contact with. And thank you both again for being here. Thank you, audience. I'm stopping the live stream.